Welcome to the Micro Collector, a podcast where I talk with the founders, operators, and people shaping the world of microbrands and independent watches. I'm your host, Justin Dorfman, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Daniel Malins, CEO of Watch Insider, a media platform focused on the business side of the watch industry. In this conversation, we talk about Daniel's journey from launching Watch Pro to building Watch Insider, the current state of the global watch industry, and the trends, challenges, and opportunities he's watching most closely. We also dive into the rise of microbrands and independent watchmaking, what separates the brands that break through from those that struggle, and Daniel's predictions for where the industry is headed over the next several years. If you enjoy the episode, be sure to subscribe for more conversations with the people behind this incredible watch community. And with that, please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Malins of Watch Insider. All right, Daniel, welcome to the Micro Collector podcast. I'm super excited to have you on today.
No, thanks for having me, Justin. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is a little bit of a different one for me, and it's actually the reason I'm really excited about it. We usually have founders of microbrands on the podcast, and I love those conversations, but it's always good to shake things up with a somebody that has like a broader industry perspective. And I know you come from a media background, you're covering the industry with Watch Insider, but you've done that for many years. So I'm really excited to get your pulse on what's happening out there in the watch industry. But before we dive into all of that good stuff, maybe for those that aren't familiar with you, you can give us a little bit of a background, you know, who you are, your company, Watch Insider, and what you guys do, and also how you got into covering the watch industry in the first place.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and give a sort of as brief an answer as possible on that. So Watch Insider is, I guess, the start and end point of what we try and do with the content we provide, whether that's through the print mag or the online content, is to add some value to the industry, really, people who operate within the industry, either at brand level or retail level especially, or anything in between. And we try and be hyper specific about it because there's a lot of information out there, both in terms of watch media, but also just generally, if you're not hyper specific, I think you're irrelevant because you'll get gobbled up by Google and Facebook and Instagram and whatever else. Not to mention the 2,000 watch bloggers that are out there. So there's no point me coming along trying to, write about watches better than Hodinkee or A Blog to Watch or Fratello, because it's impossible, really. But if you can sort of come at things from a business angle and say, okay, but what are the effects of gold prices or tariffs or business rates, or what are the implications of the Chancellor's budget in the UK or the equivalent in the US? This stuff's not as exciting to the punters, but it really is the stuff that makes the industry move. And if you're working in it and I've got some info on it or some analysis on it or an opinion piece on it, or I'm giving them the news for the first time, however you package it up, then I feel like Watch Insider has served its purpose. And, in our own tiny way, we're of some value, and we're adding some value to those people that are busy and they work in the industry every day. So that's the sort of premise of it, I guess. And it informs what we do and why we do it. How I ended up in watch as a tool is to do with my former employer. I joined way back in 2011. They were at the time very small. It was a subsidiary of a UAE operation. They had a couple of trade publications. One was giftware, one was jewelry. And it just felt to me, I was working on the jewelry mag for a little bit. I just couldn't believe there wasn't a trade publication for watches in the UK. So I'd only been there 3-4 months and I said, we've got to launch this thing. I don't think I came up with the name, to be fair. It was called Watch Pro. It's still going, albeit it's gone in a slightly different direction, hence why I'm not there now. But at the time, it was a trade publication. It was similar to what Watch Insider does now. And we did quite well with it. We got a few things wrong, but we became relevant, and that's all you got to be in media. All those things I just described, we were doing that for a number of years, over 10 years. No one else is doing it. You get a couple on the jewelry side. In America, you got In-Store and JCK and National Jeweler. It's like that, but for watches, really. And at our best, that's what we were doing. And it was not until 2018 or 17, I think, that we launched in America, which was a big moment because it's as you know, it's the biggest market for watches in the world. And that was a great tactical move, something I've now done with Watch Insider as well. So Watch Pro's still going. It's gone in a different direction, trying to be more consumery, which I have my views on. But either way, it certainly means it's vacated a space at trade level for me to say, okay, well, I think we were onto a good thing back then, and I'll do it now under a different name. And I think that's probably all your listeners need to know really about me and my background. It's what inspired me to launch Watch Insider for sure, because I've been there, I've done it, and I know what to avoid and what to do more of.
Yeah, no, I totally see the space that you're occupying and see the value. I actually subscribe to Watch Insider, and prior to subscribing to the newsletter, most of the media that I was consuming on the watch side was very consumer focused. Obviously, Instagram is all wrist rolls and brand launches and all that fun stuff. And as a collector and enthusiast, it's really engaging and interesting. And then, like you said, there's a bunch of bloggers out there that mostly focus on, reviews and announcements, right? But I've noticed, hitting my inbox now, Watch Insider coming with that perspective of, what's driving the industry? What are some of these trends? What are some things that if you're operating in this industry, you really need to be aware of and you need to think about, right? In terms of how you manage your business. So I found it to be a really good sort of broader perspective to what I'm seeing, as a consumer. I guess, what's your sort of general feeling about the industry, the state of the industry right now? And then maybe we can go into a little bit of the specific trends. Yeah, where is the industry right now? And where do you think it's heading?
It's a funny time to ask that. We may or may not be before or after Geneva. But I'd say it's not so long ago that I'd have said it was going to be quite a buoyant year. A bit of a bounce back, in it with a lowercase c of conservative, but bounce back not to sort of huge heights, but there's been a bit of a patchy couple of years. You had the boom after COVID, that inevitably then there's a vacuum that follows that a little bit, or a dropping away, but it was never that as bad as people thought. It just got back to the long-term trend line really. But it can feel disappointing in the moment because, if sales growth is negative, then no one wants that, do they? And that has a sort of trickle-down effect on the whole supply chain. So I think I was pretty confident we were going to get back to, general growth and general positivity. I mean, you only have to go back to this time last year. Whatever your politics on it, it was obviously not great for the Swiss watch industry for Trump, for reasons good and bad, to inflict 39%. Well, it wasn't 39 at the time. It turned into 39% tariffs on Swiss imports into America. And that was there's a shadow over the whole period, really, a period that should be, you got the Geneva events, but it's also buying season. And so clearly the mood music got negatively or adversely affected. And this year just didn't feel like that. It felt like there was going to be a bit of a bounce back. I didn't think there was going to be a huge amount of innovation, but I think there was going to be some commercially savvy launches, back to some growth. And I think that will still be the case, but clearly geopolitical comes back to Donald again. Geopolitical events, not just in terms of the mood, but in a very real sense, energy prices and the cost of operating as a business, especially in manufacturing, will be affected. To what extent? I guess if you want an answer out of me, I don't think to a huge extent. I think it's a wobble that will be withstood fairly easily and it's a big if, and I know that I don't know when this is going out, but if things continue to look like they'll wrap up in weeks rather than years, And you've got to remember, just to be a bit more general about it, the watch industry is very resilient and stoic. Even in my brief time, 2011, there was very much a hangover from the financial crash still. Market confidence was very low, but it got on with it. And then in the UK especially, we had, the build-up, some fairly austere years, like no one was making a huge amount of money, then the vote to leave the European Union, then the actual leaving of the European Union. And in the moment, these things feel like catastrophes. Then COVID, what you think is the ultimate catastrophe. And then you just about get over COVID, then tariffs, and then gold prices, and then the weak dollar against the Swiss franc. There's always another thing, and now it's the conflict in the Middle East. And it's not to belittle or to make light of any of these issues, but I've just seen it all before, and it's got an amazing capacity to bounce back stronger than ever, the watch industry, because it's not, no one's selling anything that anyone needs. And that should be a weakness, but it's a strength because it means it's an irrational purchase, and irrational purchases tend to survive major shocks. Do you see what I mean? Because if you're buying something that makes no sense here, then it doesn't matter that it makes even less sense now. Okay, well, I don't know if I can afford it, but I was going to buy it anyway. And the fact that it's gone up in price doesn't really bother me, So I think it's a long answer, but I think we'll be fine. I think it's going to be a decent year. I thought it was going to be a better than decent year, but I don't see it being a terrible year. I've read some stuff people have written. I think it's just clickbait, really. If things get worse, then clearly there will be a knock-on effect, not least in energy prices, like I said. But if you want to hold me to a claim or a prediction, I would say it's going to be a solid year.
Yeah, what's interesting is I think about that a lot, actually, how resilient the watch industry has been. I'm in a moment of my collecting and enthusiasm where I'm doing some historical research, right? Really trying to follow the watch industry from its conception through the various decades to where we are today. And it's amazing how resilient it has been, and how in some ways a lot of the broader geopolitical conflicts that happen drive innovation in the watch industry, the various wars and even, the quartz crisis, if you will, and how it's sort of shaped both design and sort of technical aspects of the watch industry. So it's pretty interesting.
Well, I'll just very briefly, because I know you're probably heading on to the next question, but just briefly on that, there's the ultimate sort of microcosm of what I'm talking about. So take the quartz crisis. This should have been game over. It took something that used to be functional and relevant and made it, I wouldn't say it lacked functionality, but it certainly became irrelevant and obsolete overnight. And that was before the mobile phone. I'm talking about mechanical watches, because you had a quartz watch that's going to tell the time better. And now you've got a mobile phone that tells the time better. But what effect did it have on mechanical watches? They're booming like no one could have ever predicted, because it almost just fast-track the process of acknowledging this is actually just a decorative piece of jewelry. And once you can get your head around that, what should be a crisis turns into, oh, okay, we're now looking at this through a different lens. And it's certainly, you ask Rolex or Patek whether it did it any harm. I know we're several decades on now, but it's like that should have been, if it was about rational decision-making, it should have been game over. And the fact that it wasn't, I know it's not an exact comparison with, market shocks, because back then it was a bit more existential, but I'm just saying it finds a way, doesn't it? And if the whole modus operandi of the watch industry is to tug at the heartstrings and say, you need to have this thing, knowing deep down that no one needs a watch, but I think that makes it more, not less resilient to the market shocks I'm talking about, because that lack of rational thought almost works in your favor, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One question I have for you is, in this current landscape, do you have a sense of who you feel the winners are going to be and those that maybe are going to struggle more? Or are there bright lights within this sort of haze that we're in right now that seem to be sort of chugging along or even growing despite everything that's going on and all the uncertainty out there?
It's a good question. The generally accepted answer, which I know is not what you were asking me, but be to say that, especially if you look at a lot of the pre-owned sales data, is that everything is becoming more and more top heavy. Those that have always been strong are getting even stronger. But I don't find that particularly interesting. I think that's fairly natural. And I think that probably applies across different industries. I don't know data from the car industry, for instance, but I'd be surprised if it's not the case that Porsche and Ferrari and, Aston Martin are getting even stronger whilst the young pretenders are struggling a little bit. I don't know. I haven't got empirical evidence to back that up. But of course, you see a little bit of that. The reason I don't find it very interesting is because it was ever thus, in the time I've been in the watch industry, everyone always talks about the squeezed out middle, You've got your big players at a certain price point. You've got your Seikos and Citizens delivering amazing watches, and a lot of the indies that I'm sure we'll come on to at this sort of price point. And it's quite difficult to justify, the sort of $2,000 mark, because when people get to that level, they know they only have to save a little bit more and they can get what you would call, one of the super premium brands. Well, maybe we're seeing that again, but I don't think it's novel. I don't think it's new. And I don't think it's really got anything to do with particular events that are happening in the industry. I think it's just a trend that will never end, really. Rolex is really strong and it will get stronger. I mean, it's not much of a headline. Everyone knows that's true. But it doesn't matter if as long as the size of the pie is going up, and that's the question, will it or won't it? Does it really matter that Rolex are hogging a bit more of it, or AP or Patek, Cartier? Not really. There's plenty of money out there to be made. And that's for the sort of mainstream group brands, as well as the sort of guys that would be at Wind Up or British Watchmakers Day or, whatever. So let me get back to your original question. Who do I think? Was it about which brand you think?
Maybe not brands particularly. I mean, you touched on it a little bit there, who's doing well and who's sort of like, what are the shining lights in this space? And I think, like you pointed out, at the high end, especially because of that irrational element to human psychology, that continues to grow and maybe even grow, even faster in certain times. I'm curious to get your perspective on the micro brand and independent segment. I mean, that's obviously an area that I'm personally very interested in, and this podcast specifically focuses on. And you mentioned Wind Up. I think we were talking about it right before we hit record. Going to an event like Wind Up, you wouldn't know that we're in a softer market for the watch industry because there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of people. I was surprised that this was Wind Up Dallas. I was surprised at the number of people, knowing that this is probably one of their smaller shows. I'm going to the San Francisco one in May, and I'm interested to see there. But yeah, just the number of brands, the innovation as well. I mean, a lot of these brands are bringing new materials, new technologies to the table. They're taking new spins on things. And yeah, just the enthusiasm from the collector base. Curious to get your take on that segment, because some of these brands do fall in that $2,000, $1,000 range that can be challenging and is historically known to be challenging, but there's also a lot of energy, a lot of innovation and enthusiasm in that space. So how should we think about the current state of the microbrand or independent segment?
It's a big question that I'll try and give a small answer to for the sake of our sanity and for time. There's a few things I'd say. So firstly, I mean, Wind Up does skew one's impression some, because it's an extraordinary event. I just interviewed Blake's going out in the next edition. There you go. I've got a plug in. And I've been very transparent about the respect I have for that show. I mean, it does what it says on the tin really, really well. And it's only as good as the visitors it manages to attract, to bring it back to more of the question you were asking. And these collectors are extraordinary. I won't say good or bad. They are just not ordinary people. They know everything, about every watch reference from the 1970s, So of course they're really interested in this new sort of wave of because for years we've sort of used to just the same players over and over. And now there's hundreds of them. I mean, that might be unsustainable. That maybe is a rabbit hole we can go down later. But it's amazing, like you say, to make yourself noticed at that price range for a brand that no one's really heard of when you start. By definition, no one's heard of you when you start. You've got to do things better. There's no point just being as good as what's out there. And I think that appeals to collectors because they're fully aware that these guys are pedaling twice as fast just to go at the same speed as the incumbents, the ones that have been there for years and years. I also think, to move on to another point, I also think that if you are in that category, and no one is without ego when they buy a watch. Some egos are very big, some are tiny, but there's still a little bit of ego. If you get in that trap that I mentioned before, where the price point is pretty close to, you and I can choose a brand to mention. It might be Tag, it might be Tudor, it might be a little bit above that. And that therefore puts you off buying a brand that, rightly or wrongly, you think is not quite as prestigious as them and is only a tiny bit cheaper. So, what am I doing? I'll just hold off and buy the Ranger by Tudor, whatever. I don't think necessarily that ego question comes into it with the lesser known independents. I don't think they would worry about walking around looking like they've got a cheap version of a Black Bay or of a Carrera or because it's so completely different. And it's almost a virtue that no one's really heard of these brands. And I think the independent sector has really played up to that tremendously. I think they see that as a real positive, and quite rightly. Added on to my first point about the quality and the innovation having to be very good necessarily, because otherwise I'll get lost in all the noise. And I think I also, you mentioned $2,000 watches. Some of these independents are not $2,000. Some of them are $800, $900. Men especially, but human beings love collecting. I don't know why. It can be stamps, it can be Pokemon cards, it can be handbags, it can be, in our case, watches. And yeah, if you're lucky enough to have all the money in the world, then you have a Datejust and you have a Air King or you have a Nautilus. But that applies just because you haven't got the same amount of disposable income. There's still that desire to start collecting. And people might not be that interested in collecting, I don't know, trying to think of a relevant brand. But you see it even with the mainstream. People do collect G-Shock. People are really into Seiko and Citizen. They're not independents, but they're beautiful watch. They're brilliantly made watch brands. They've got some stories to tell. So I think all you're seeing is that, but now there's more than ever before to do it with. So you might start collecting Brew watches that you hadn't heard of 2 years ago, or Fears, or Studio Underdog, or, both of us could name, some of these have probably been on your podcast. I just think it's the right idea at the right time. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like I'm giving an opinion just from the tone of my voice, but I'm really not. I would love it to be sustainable. But it's not going anywhere for the time being, is it? There's a real appetite to have different watches at a price point that represents value for money based on the build quality and the innovation and the technology and all the things you mentioned. And America's not a saturation point. I mean, it's the biggest market in the world, but if you did a you got to be careful about statistics because it doesn't always represent. But if you did Swiss exports, America's number one by a mile. But if you did Swiss watch exports per capita, per head of population, America's miles behind. So you could argue that all the best days are yet to come. If you've got your sort of flag in the sand in America now, I've every reason to believe it's only going to get better and better because the knowledge and the passion over there. I thought the UK had it, but I'm here to tell you the USA is on a different level.
Yeah, super interesting. I actually wanted to ask you a question that I was wondering when I was at Wind Up. We hear a lot about sort of the, in some ways, unfriendly consumer practices, let's call it, that happen in the luxury segment, right? Just, the challenges of buying a watch. Sometimes you go to the boutique and, there's watches on display, but they're not for sale, and the frustration. I have friends that have Rolexes and have questioned to me in the past, Microbrands, you're collecting all these Microbrands. If you could, wouldn't you just buy the one Rolex that you could have versus all these Microbrands? But then on the other side of the coin, they are complaining to me about how they can't get the Rolex that they want, or like it's frustrating how some of these brands are treating consumers that have bought from them in the past, right? And when I was at Wind Up, I did see people with Rolexes and higher end luxury watches that had Christopher Wards that they had bought at the show, or had Baltics, or, all these different Microbrands, in some cases, multiple of them. And they seemed to be pretty excited about walking out of the show with a number of watches that they were able to buy then and there. And it had me wondering, do you think that some of that collector base that used to focus more on the high-end luxury, maybe they don't have the disposable income to have a huge collection in that space? It was like saving up for that one Rolex or that handful. Now is just frustrated with the ever increasing price points and the way that they're being treated, that they're now, going into the Microbrand independent space and sort of collecting because, again, they can get a bunch of watches. They can actually build out a collection, but also, you're there meeting the founder, right? And the founder is listening to you and engaging with you. And it's just a completely different experience to what you would have if you walked into a boutique, a Rolex boutique, for instance. Do you think that that's a trend that people are moving down market? Or do you think that's just, a little anecdote that I maybe noticed or thought of at the show?
No, I think you're basically right. I thought you were suggesting people are no longer sort of buying their Rolex because of the friction that we're talking about, and the whole experience it's great when you go in and get given some champagne, but then the reality of being put on a waiting list and whatever. I would have disagreed with you if you said that's been replaced by, but I think what you ended up saying, if I was right in the way I listened to it, is that still happens, but maybe just they'll get the one Rolex, or they'll get the one Omega, or they'll get the one or two max, and rather than, they know that is many years away, a full collection. So then it's like, okay, well, we got that, and actually on the side here, we don't need to wait years. We can go to Wind Up and buy this straight away, because you don't want to sort of talk about other people's wealth, but most people can go in and afford $400, $800, $600, whatever it may be. They might have to save up a little bit, but so it makes it really accessible, which I took as being the essence of your point. And then additionally, what you said about the face-to-face contact with the owner or the designer or both, or, whatever. These people, as I said before, they're nuts. Like, they know so much about watches. They might, I've been to these shows where some of the people at the brands say that they get educated by the punter. It should be the other way around. And they take it in good humor, obviously. But of course that appeals. I mean, that is the opposite of the experience that we're talking about, where you're in store. Yeah, you get treated very well, and there is something nice about it. But it's not the same, is it? It's not that same connection. Oh, you're Mike France from Christopher Ward. Oh, you're Richard Bank from Studio Under. What can replace that? I mean, it's amazing. And it doesn't cost you the world. Some are more expensive than others, of course. But so I don't see that changing, even if the independent ecosystem is at its peak, or not. It might keep growing, but even if it is at its peak, it's not going to go away. That desire to own multiple watches at a price that's accessible, and makes you feel really special because you've got to know, as you said, the owner of the brand or whoever representative from that brand. And then you might go back the year after, and then you develop your collection. And, I've already said this, but it's not falling into that trap that I said before of feeling like you're buying a pale imitation of, which, by the way, I wholeheartedly don't think is a fair criticism. It actually really annoys me. But over the course of 200 years, through the marketing and all the word of mouth, we are where we are. You can't deny it. Like, people think Rolex is here, and they think Patek's here, and they think, yeah, Richard Mille, which I have my own views on, but they think whatever, you can argue against it, but it's a reality. People do think that these, so rightly or wrongly, they will say, well, yeah, I love Orius, or I love Raymond Vale, or I love Nomos. And these watches aren't often as good or close to as good, but it will play on their mind that they're getting the pale imitation of, even if I don't agree that's fair. F1's susceptible to thinking like that. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I don't think the independents suffer from that. And I think that's a huge part of why people have decided, okay, I have these one or two special watches, and now I'm going to go mad on the independents because I can just collect away on that side. And they will do stuff with design that the major brands won't dare to do. They've started to do a bit more in the last 6 or 7 years, but it's still nowhere near what some of those brands I've mentioned would dare do, even if it's just from a color perspective. So I think you put all those things together, and then it's obvious why that's become a much bigger thing, and it's going to get more the case. I can assure you, that you'll have your anchor watch that you like to wear, and then you'll say, okay, well, what else? And I think right now the best option is not necessarily the traditional $1,000 watches. It's actually going to the independent sector, which is obviously what you know very well all about.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of times the sustainability of the ever increasing number of brands that are launching. Do you have a perspective on what the best, or those that will last, will need to do to separate them from the rest of the crowd? Sort of any things that founders of these microbrands need to be thinking about to ensure that they're one of the ones that sticks around versus, inevitably, there's only a certain market size. Some of these will not make it, right? So any perspective there on what separates those that make it from not?
Yes, part of that, the answer to that depends on the detail of the question in a way. What is sustainable for one brand is not for another. I mean, for some, it blurs the line between a profession and a hobby. I can't name many, but I'm sure I've met a couple who are sort of bankers in the day and do this in the evening to fund it. And they might be happy sort of just treading water forever. It doesn't mean they're going to go away or close down or liquidate, but it does mean that they're not going to be a thing, really. They're just going to turn up at wind up every couple of years. And that's fine. I don't judge those people. But if the question is, those that really want to be the next Christopher Wall, well, I think, unfortunately, one of the simplest answers I can give is that it depends a lot, maybe more than 50%, on what money and resources you have to throw at it. I mean, the league table of watch brands there's an almost perfect correlation between, annual turnover and marketing budget or research and development budget, the whole budget. You can't cheat that. There are ways that you can inflate your status above where you would be if the correlation was perfect. And I think that's what people should focus on is, okay, I know that I'm going to be within these parameters or this part, because I can't cheat my way to being the second biggest watch brand in the world, but nor should I be worse than, whatever. And within that, there are ways that you can, tricks of the trade to get yourself to the best version of what you can be. And I think that is to do with maybe understanding where the engagement lies with the consumer. This is something people have talked about at length long before me, but, it looks different even compared to 2011 when I came along and now. So I would have 7 or 8 years ago, I'd have felt like, okay, we need to do a bit of Instagram. We need to attend this show. The shows have changed, like wind-ups changed. So you got to change with it. TikTok didn't exist. And it shows how old I am, because I suspect TikTok's now the thing in the past. They've probably moved on to another one. I know Instagram's still relevant, but is it as relevant as it was? I don't know. And people that do know that are probably the ones, making all the right moves. Because as I say, you can't cheat yourself to being richer than you are. The marketing budget is what it is. But what you do with that obviously matters. And that can be the placements on, social media or what it looks like on social media. It's not just having the space, but what are you doing with it? I've mentioned them already, but I saw Studio Underdog up the side of a hill with their watchmaker with doing something. I think it was with the Oracle Time guys in the UK, the magazine. Well, okay, I can't tell you whether that moved the needle, but I know they're doing stuff, aren't they? They're trying different things. It was probably no extra money, but it's just that it's money and effort and sort of brain calories that you're dedicating towards it. So I think if you work backwards from your customer and the type of profile they are, where these people are hanging out, both literally, physically, that might be Brooklyn, it might be, but also in terms of the internet, are they on forums? Are they on Facebook groups? I ask those questions genuinely not knowing the answer, but if I did know the answer, I know that would really help me. And that informs my answer to your question, I guess.
Yeah. I think you hit on an interesting point as well. And I've heard Ariel Adams talk about this a little bit as well on his podcast. And I noticed it myself at Windup. I also notice it in the conversations that I have with founders is there's not one type of microbrand or one type of microbrand founder in terms of their aspirations. It definitely is the microbrand and microbrand founder that is trying to be the next Christopher Ward, that is trying to go big and become the next major independent brand, let's call it, right? But there's also the the microbrand founder that this is their passion, this is their love, and they love doing this, and they actually don't want to grow past a certain point because it would change the nature of what they do, right? And they're just happy sort of doing everything themselves. I think it's unfair to also put it into one box with my question and say, like, what separates those that are going to be sustainable and last long term versus those that don't? Because again, if your goals are different in the end, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And there's sustainability on both sides. One final trend that I've been keeping my eye on, and again, Windup is the last event that I went to, so it's sort of where I picked up a lot of these things, and I just love to get your perspective on is this sort of revival of heritage brands, right? So when I went to Windup, there was, all the exciting micro brands and independent brands like the Christopher Wards, like the Ferrers, like the Formexes and the Brews, but was also Nevada Grenchen, and there was also, Volcane, and, Accutron, and all these heritage brands that seem to be coming back, maybe under new ownership in some cases, but definitely with a new energy and sort of leaning on their history, but introducing sort of a more modern take on it. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something to keep an eye on? Is there something there? And is that sort of something that we should continue to look out for? I know there was a recent announcement with Universal Genève as well, right? That's maybe that on a much larger scale, but curious to get your take on that beyond sort of that Rolex luxury sort of known segment, the new independent microbrands. There's this sort of revival of heritage brands that's kind of interesting.
Yes, agree. I mean, most answers to these sort of questions are necessarily gray. They're not black and white. If I was going to give a black and white answer, it would probably be no, actually. But I think it's no with several caveats, because I think you are on something. And by the way, I don't know is an opinion in the same way that your question was laced with sort of, the impressions you got from Windup and what you're hearing. Of course it's a thing. And these revival, I guess the reason I was erring towards no is I don't think you're seeing quite a bit of it at the moment, but I've seen a lot of it in the 15 years I've been doing this thing. And most of it doesn't mean a whole amount. It's not picking on anyone or trying to be pejorative necessarily. It's just saying, and some of them are successful, but it's just saying that I don't think it sort of fools anyone. And I'm not saying they're trying to fool anyone, but I think this whole thing of taking a brand that was operational in 1838 in Switzerland and then was defunct for 120 years. But if you buy the what would you say? Not the rights. If you buy the company name,
Trademark.
Yes, thank you. Then you can do everything you would do as a new brand, whether you are Isotope or Brew or any of the others we mentioned. You can do that, but you've got a ready-made backstory because it's 180 years old. That's not a nothing. That is a something, especially if you lean into stuff. If it's more than just a trick, if you're actually leaning into some design cues from those days, which happen to be in vogue now anyway, smaller watches and a lot of that. But that's not. I think that's happening anyway, is my point. Like a lot of these new brands that have no heritage or history are still leaning into a lot of the older designs right now because it's quite on trend. These guys are just doing it on steroids because they're reviving old brands that were a thing and then weren't a thing. Well, why did they become not a thing in the first place? If they were that great, then they wouldn't have gone bust. There might be some exceptions to that. So bringing it back and saying, well, this thing was a great thing, then it got mismanaged, but now we've brought it back. That is interesting. Even I'm interested in that. It's like I'm being cynical, but I do think that's quite a nice thing. I just don't think it's a game-changing thing because I've seen this film before, several times. And I think it is having a moment. I just don't think it's having a huge moment. And you mentioned, the brands you mentioned was Accutron. Well, they never really went away. They've got a lot of energy now because Citizen Watch America are phenomenal. And, I remember seeing Accutron, I think in Mad Men or something, and just loving that Don Draper was doing an advert for them. But, and that, by the way, it's an amazing brand with so many stories to tell. It's not a revival though, is it? It'd been a bit neglected and now it's not neglected. And people like that because they love new brands, but they love, reputable brands even more. But I'll conclude there. I think it's a thing, but I don't think it's moving the needle a huge amount.
This has been super interesting, Daniel. again, I was really excited to get sort of your perspective as somebody that, speaks to so many different people and covers so many different areas of the industry. So I really appreciate you coming by and sharing your thoughts on these questions. If folks are listening or watching this and they are interested in learning more about Watch Insider, where are some of the places that they can go to check it out, subscribe to the newsletter, or follow you along?
Well, I'll keep it simple. Watchinsider.com. Instagram is Watch Insider Official, because some pesky person had taken Watch Insider, unfortunately. See, it's all very glamorous until you understand how these things go. It's just, you take what you can get. But no, watchinsider.com. That's the starting point. You can link through to LinkedIn, to Instagram from there. And I'd like to think we provide some interesting, it's not all boring industry stuff. There is some pretty cool stuff that even collectors would be interested by or interested about. But yeah, thanks again for having me on, Justin. It's, you realize when you have these conversations, which I'm normally on the other side of the microphone of, you realize you do care more than you probably think you do, because it takes for someone to ask the questions. Actually, I do have an opinion on that, so I really appreciate you asking me on.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I'm excited to continue following along as you build Watch Insider and consuming your content. As I said, it's been a nice way to expose myself to the broader trends of the industry beyond just being a collector and enthusiast. So really appreciate what you're doing. Appreciate you stopping by today, and have a great rest of your day over there.
Thanks very much, Justin.